So, this video is going to be a bit different. In this month's regular collaborative history series that I do with channels Samurai and Ninja History and Sengoku Studies, we decided that we wanted to cover topics relating to the Japanese Imperial Court and overall nobility, which it does seem like an area of history that is seldom discussed. And because of that, I can think of no better things to discuss in this video than simply trying to define what the Japanese Imperial Court even was, how the samurai relate to it and the nobility itself, and then what sort of impact, if at all, the court had during the centuries when samurai ruled the country. That might seem like a lot, but I assure you I think we can get through this in a reasonable fashion. And as usual, I will leave links down below to the videos made by Samurai and Ninja History and Sengoku Studies so that you can learn more about this fascinating subject. But with that said, let's jump in right away with our first question. What was the Japanese Imperial Court? Well, the Imperial Court itself, as you might have guessed, was a governing institution that spanned back centuries into Japanese history, coming to exist long before the samurai were even a thing. As we know, according to legend, the first Japanese emperor, Jimmu, was said to have ruled from 660 to 585 BC. Now, for each subsequent emperor, we can logically say that some form of governing body akin to a court would have been around. But in terms of taking the actual form of what we today would usually consider the idea of the pre-modern Japanese imperial court, we should start things off in the Nara period, when the capital was located in Nara rather than Kyoto itself just yet. It was here we see the real forming of what would come to be the early Japanese government through the Taiho Ritsuryo, or Taiho Code, which was heavily influenced by the current Tang government in China, and was a measure to centralize the Japanese government. The court itself has often come to be known as chote, which means morning court. Thus, this term comes to refer to the fact that most meetings of the court happen before the afternoon. But who made up the court, and what did they do? Well, the simplest answer to that might be a term you are familiar with: kuge. Kuge were court nobles, essentially the aristocracy of old Japan. These were individuals from powerful ruling families who held tremendous amounts of wealth, power, and influence. Many of them were even directly related to the imperial family itself. The most prominent of these early ruling families would of course come to be the Fujiwara, a name which I imagine plenty of you have heard me talk about before. But, at least early on, simply being a member of a noble aristocratic family did not necessarily guarantee your position as a kuge, as you needed to be appointed a fitting government position or title. Now, the actual wide array of these court ranks themselves is pretty complex, so I'm not going to get into all that here, but it should be noted that there was obviously an internal hierarchy that dominated the order of it. And it was from these kuge court nobles and their various ranks within the court that the country was formally run, as they ensured the emperor's will. Essentially, the imperial court has been basically described as the Japanese government of that time. Soon enough, however, the capital would be relocated to Heian-kyo, which would evolve into the Kyoto we know today. This move began the Heian period of Japanese history. Throughout this time, the court continued to get more elaborate and lavish as arts and culture flourished throughout the new capital. But while this was all happening, over time the Ritsuryo system had been steadily eroded by the shoen, which were large plots of privately owned land that was free from government interference and taxation. These powerful estates were of course owned by noble families, which in many cases made kuge all the more wealthy and influential. Indeed, their rise would in time come to negatively affect the actual influence of the emperor himself, as his own power began to wane. We even come to see emperors fall under control of the prominent Fujiwara for an extended period of time. However, it should be noted that the prominence of the Fujiwara over the court came more from their marital relation with the imperial family, rather than through their actual wealth and status outside the court. Yet, the main takeaway here was that there became periods where the court was not ruled necessarily by the emperor, although symbolically it still was. Rather, the court was instead ruled by powerful families who simply saw fit to run the country themselves. This continuous tug-of-war between influence was not to last forever, though. In fact, it rather resembles child's play for the blood that would soon be spilt and the wars that would soon come to rage. You see, over the past centuries, as the government continued to evolve, so too did another element within the country. This, of course, being the status of the budding warrior class, soon to be known as the samurai. The warrior class was initially seen as below the nobility, because of course they started out as paid muscle. They collected taxes for landowners, guarded property and influential figures, and of course went off to fight wars when necessary. These professional soldiers would in time make up entire private armies for landholding families, who were then able to exercise more power and at times autonomy. And this is where the line really starts to blur between the nobility and the warrior class, which of course gets even more difficult to distinguish after the rise of the Taira and Minamoto families. Both the Taira and the Minamoto were descended from the imperial family itself. By all accounts, they were nobility, yet they were also heavily militarized through the samurai. In fact, it was not uncommon for prominent warrior families of the Heian and Kamakura periods to have noble or even imperial roots. This was in large part thanks to a practice of extra sons of significant noble families being sent out to make their own mark in the provinces, being that they were not likely to inherit anything from their family. So this often meant that they had to become more militarized in order to survive. And throughout the 12th century, after several major revolts, followed by the largest internal conflict Japan had seen up until that point, the Genpei War, the power of the military had become absolute. In 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo became the first shogun of the Kamakura shogunate, or Bakufu, and from the seat of his military government in the Kanto region, he essentially ruled the country, being that he held full jurisdiction over the warrior class itself. He could give land to families and he could take land away from families. And so, by the Kamakura period, all the land was mostly, if not all, held by loyal samurai families. The samurai had become deeply ingrained into the very inner workings of the Japanese government, which then makes it further difficult to distinguish if the samurai were really part of the nobility or not. The real correct answer was that no, they were not officially part of the aristocracy. But that also does not mean that aristocratic ties could not be forged anyway. In many instances, they could claim some form of official descent from a ruling family throughout their past lineage, or by adoption or marriage, which a lot would come to do in order to gain more legitimacy. We can later see that each of the three great unifiers did this in their own unique ways. There was also the commonality that many prominent warriors throughout the Muromachi and later Sengoku periods would at times be granted court ranks just on their own, usually becoming lower kuge, with some being able to ascend to higher. This all works to continue to blur the line between the samurai and the nobility, as although there was a definite line that existed between the two, it was a line that at times could easily be crossed. This then brings us back to the court. What was to be the new status of the imperial court now with the samurai in control of Japan, and in many cases jumping across the fence to get into the role of the nobility? Well, surprisingly not much. Initially the court still held some significant administrative influence, but over time their authority continued to get eroded upon by that of the shogunate. And although they still possessed some minor influence over matters, they became pretty inconsequential. Yet, despite this, they were still symbolically very important and a necessary component to the samurai military government. Plenty of official decrees and titles still needed to be doled out by the emperor and the court, something which the shogunate could never really get around, although there were many attempts to strong-arm the system. The court's continued relevancy stemmed from the fact that it was still the emperor's governing body, and the emperor was still symbolically the sole ruler and embodiment of the nation. The shogun himself was always to be beneath the emperor, despite what power dynamics tell us was the real truth. There would even come to be a significant period when a rebel emperor went and established his own second imperial court, thus creating an age of violence between supporters of the official northern court and the rebel southern court, which would come to be known as the Nanboku-cho period. Throughout the remainder of samurai rule over Japan, the court's actual governing ability would continue to be eclipsed by the power of the shogunate. Yet we can at last see by the reign of the final shogunate, an official decree from the third great unifier and former shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu would establish an actual working relationship between the shogunate and the court. This was known as the Kinchu Narabini Kuge Shohato, or Law on the Emperor and the Court Nobles. It consisted of 17 articles which were meant to establish an official system that dictated not only how the court should function in the new era, but also how the shogunate and the court should interact with one another moving forward. This is significant because it does not appear that any other official decree like this had ever been issued by any other past shogunate. This document included what the role of the emperor should look like at that point in time, how the court should be organized, how officials should be either appointed or dismissed, the official separation of the kuge and samurai families, how families get promoted, and so much more. I find this whole document to be super interesting, so I'll leave a link below to where you can read more about it. It would actually come to remain in place throughout the entire duration of the Edo period, and would never come to be revised. Of course, the court and all the samurai and nobility would be completely transformed following the Meiji Restoration, as with the dissolution of the samurai class and the imperial court, new systems heavily resembling Western aristocratic systems would be established. This new system would come to be known as the Kazoku, and would incorporate both members of the past nobility and samurai into one new Japanese aristocracy. But that goes beyond the scope of this channel, so I'm going to leave it at that. All in all, the role of the imperial court and the Japanese nobility can be viewed as rather strange and at times confusing, largely due to the samurai coming to eclipse their influence, and even then coming to heavily resemble what we would commonly consider to be the noble ruling body. And once again, it doesn't help matters that the situation becomes even more complex thanks to the fact that so many samurai were able to achieve noble status themselves. I keep saying it, but that line between the two was certainly a blurry one at times throughout history. Yet, I hope this video serves to at least shed some light on the subject for you, helping you to understand a bit more about these fascinating details of Japanese history. And remember, there are also two other great videos on this subject of nobility, the court, and the emperor from Samurai and Ninja History and Sengoku Studies that have been made in collaboration to this one. Links in the description. So, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.